will give the first part of this talk, which is mostly about correlative methods actually, and then John will take over with some of the other types of methods available. The arrows work? Yes. Okay, so Curtis said quite a lot of this. I'm just showing it in a slightly different way using maps really. So yeah, species distribution models or habitat suitability models. You can take these sort of species distribution data, can be presence, absence, or it could be abundance data if you're lucky enough to have it, and link that with the climatic variables. So I'm just showing it spatially, a different way to Curtis did, but you link, say, the temperature point where your species present point is, and then you turn that into a suitability map for that particular present moment. And then if you want to, you can project that into the future. And there's many different ways, correlative models that do this, listed some of them there, Maxent, Bioclim, generalized linear models, generalized additive models, and some of the others there. And so I'll just go through, I think, 3 studies where people have used them in slightly different ways. This was work that John showed the report this morning, The Economics of Climate Resilience. And Miranda Jones did this work a few years ago now. And she ran 3 different models on a number of different species. And the data is presented in a table, so you can sort of see the ranking of the winners and losers of the different species. This was on the UK EEZ. And you can see, so the second column shows the median of the 3 models in terms of habitat suitability change, but you can see why sort of she's used 3 different models, because in the third column you're getting quite a different number in terms of that shift across the 3 different models. So the 3 different ways of doing that correlation basically present a different result. So it's quite useful if you're to appreciate that you're not getting an absolute value here. We're not predicting, we're projecting into the future, and we don't know the certainty in these. So you can use this type of model to look at that the change in suitability in an area, but also the latitudinal shifts, if that's what you want to look at as well. For this work, Miranda used a global climate model, so it would have been maybe 1.5 degree, 2 degree grid cells that she was modelling. But more recently, the Met Office in the UK has produced some downscaled modelling for the UK. So we've been, or for the UK shelf actually, so wider than the UK. So we've been able to use some of this in species distribution models, which has made them a lot more applicable to this part of the world. So Louise Rutherford at the University of Exeter did this work where she was looking specifically at the North Sea, and she used this downscaled climate projection, and she used GAMS as well. So she did fewer species than Miranda. Because she was using GAMS, she was able to look at the parameters individually and spend a bit more time looking into the detail of what was actually happening with each of the species and the different variables. And one of the interesting things she found was that actually some of these species would be constrained by depth in the future. So they'd actually already shifted a lot in terms of depth from the 1980s to now, and there wasn't a lot of depth left for them to move to in the future. And then a bit of a combination of the approach. Here's a couple of studies that John and myself have done recently, where we took the global model, climate model outputs, and we took the downscaled model, and we nested the downscaled model into the global model. So you can see, I'll just point out where this is quite blocky outside the UK shelf. That's I think that's 1.5 degree grid cells. But within that, you've got this higher resolution, I think it was 1/3 of a degree on the UK shelf. So it means that you're getting, when you're looking at the environmental data, you're getting the tides in there, you're getting the local currents and some of the riverine inputs, but you're able to use the species presence data from outside that area. So if I know a species, for example, is present in Spain, which is outside our downscaled model, then I can look at those environmental preferences the environmental preferences and project into the UK waters, if you see what I mean. And we did a couple of studies, one of which on non-native species, and one of which on harmful algae. But there's many other, obviously, lots of possibilities with this kind of work. Many more downscale projections are appearing in different parts of the world now. So in shallower shelf seas where the global models aren't quite so useful, we can start to do more of these studies, which is really nice. And also we're getting different climate scenarios. So you can start to think about actually different emissions controls. What's that going to mean potentially for a species shift? And that can really help to sell a story if that's what you want to do. And also we're getting a lot more variables. So the Met Office data that I showed there was only had temperature, salinity and depth, but we're starting to get models through which have a lot more pH, oxygen, plankton, productivity, which can really improve your models. You can also include substrates, which is not something we've done, but if you know a species is not going to occur in a certain place, you can sort of do a gap analysis at the end of that. And also something we talked about a little bit yesterday was actually using this to see if you've seen a change in the past, you can use this kind of modelling to actually see, is that related to the climate change, or is there something else going on that's not explaining some of those changes? So I think I'll hand over to John then, who's looking at a few different kinds of modelling techniques.
Yeah, so this next bit is a little bit of a sort of literature review, really. When we were doing all these correlative models, we looked around about what other ways are there to project into the future. So I've just got a few slides that describe the different types of modelling. This is a similar thing to what Bryony's just described by Lenoir et al. And they did it for horse mackerel, anchovy, sprat, pollock, sole, haddock, saithe and turbot. It's very similar sort of that correlative thing. You can see their projections for turbot and sole over the right there, from the past to the future. The red bits are where their species will increase, the blue bits are where they're going to decrease. It's quite a well-used methodology in Europe. There's a similar thing was tried. This is something that's fairly new, that was done by the joint research, what's it called, JRC in Italy. So they've come up with a habitat suitability model for Atlantic bluefin tuna. It predicts the feeding and spawning areas of both small and medium-sized tuna. They run this at an almost weekly level using remote sensing data to try and predict where the tuna are going to go. As I mentioned earlier, tuna are slowly spreading up into the North Atlantic again. And this is predicting the feeding area for, I think this is, large tuna. They're predicting this almost as a sort of a real-time tool that they're doing. Other models that have become a bit popular in Europe, there's quite a few labs in Europe that are obsessed with something called dynamic energy budget models. It was developed by a Dutch group. Basically, it's all based around sort of energy apportionment, so food that's taken in, some of it goes to structural reserve, some of it goes to reproduction, some of it goes to maturation. There's a nice website which basically it's quite a generalised way of modelling. It's been applied to hundreds and hundreds of species. There's a website called List My Pet, which has all the parameters, and it covers everything from sponges to humans, using these dynamic energy budget models. But I just showed a nice picture of one that's been done for Pacific tuna. But the reason I'm talking about this one mainly is that there's a group that was based in the Netherlands by Lorna Thiel, who tried to use this approach to predict the distribution of sole and place in the North Sea. So she used outputs from a physical model which had plankton and temperature, and she was trying to show the difference between years in the habitat suitability, particularly for place. And some things to notice are that she shows that in certain years the coast of the Netherlands and the coast of Europe becomes blue there, So it's becoming less suitable for place, and that's actually what we're starting to see. You saw the things about place moving out of the place box. Myron hates this paper, by the way, but so I can see.
I really like Lorna, but I can tell you why I hate it.
I can see him cringing in the back.
Can I tell you why I hate it?
Yeah, go on then.
I mean, the DEB is a very interesting approach. It handles temperature not extremely well. But in this model, there was one piece of code that said, as fish get like 5 centimeters larger, their preferred habitat goes down 1 degree Celsius. Period. And that one piece of code drove that. And it's not about allocation, it's not about feeding, it's not about temperature tolerance, it's about preferred temperatures decreasing, like for a certain size fish, as they get bigger, it goes down. And I didn't notice it when I reviewed it.
Well, that's your fault.
No. But I mean, the approach is very cool, and there's a lot of interesting DEB work. Cool.
So I'm just highlighting it, really just show that there's a lot of work going on this.
Yes.
There's a group in France that are doing it for anchovy as well, as part of the Ceres project. Aerobic scope models, there's quite a lot of these around. So they're based around this idea, again, that there's a temperature preference, a minimum and maximum, that varies between species, that species try to maximise their metabolic scope. And this has been used for a whole lot of modelling in Europe, using both temperature projections and oxygen projections in some cases. There's a nice group of people in the Mediterranean that have really taken to using this, using outputs from laboratory experiments and then using that to predict where the species are going to go. So there's a nice paper by Cucco et al. For a particular lagoon and gulf in Italy, I think it's Italy, where they're trying to predict where grey mullets would go, using, as I say, experimental results. And they show that during the spring and the beginning of the summer, the lagoon area, this bit, is more suitable than the gulf. But during the rest of the year, the gulf is more suitable. It's quite a nice approach that they're now to take outputs from the laboratory and try and use it in an ecological sense. There's a related paper by the same group where they have a native, these are both herbivorous fish in the Mediterranean, a native species and an introduced species which have different metabolic scopes and temperature preferences. And they again use experiments to try and predict the distribution of the two species now and in the future. And they show a contracting range for the native one and an expanding range for the non-native one. So this is now and the future. This is the native one, this is the non-native one. And again, it's a similar sort of habitat suitability model, but based on laboratory physiological experiments. And the final block that I want to talk about, I mean, Myron has spent had a living making these sorts of models, but they're all based on individuals and modelling either groups of individuals or individuals. There's a whole load of individual-based models applied in Europe. They try and sort of predict distribution or processes from a bottom-up sense by putting in place the rules, the physiological rules. You get the distributions as an emergent property of that. One that we're doing at CFAS is it's based on a model by Sophie Petron and Clive Fox of larval growth and distribution. So this was the model that they did for cod larval growth in the North Sea, but we're now using this to get outputs from physical models to predict what's going to happen to cod, haddock, sprat and herring. And some of that's a bit similar to things that Myron's done in the past. We also have a PhD student at the University of Reading who's working on mackerel. This is an interesting one because it has elements of individual-based modelling and DEB modelling combined. So it does have some elements of energy budgets in there. Tries to model the life cycle of mackerel. One thing we've noticed from all of the habitat distribution models that Bryony mentioned is that none of them can cope with mackerel. all of the models are really bad at predicting mackerel. This doesn't seem too bad. So this is about the best approach we have at the moment. Not that the picture's particularly good, but this is seems to be the most promising of the models we've thrown at mackerel so far. Yeah, this is a Norwegian model. Again, it's an IBM. It's focused on cod larvae again, trying to, a bit similar to the one I showed from Pitois. These are the sort of physiological rules that it's a sort of particle tracking thing. It uses phytoplankton and zooplankton to model the growth of the larvae and then the distribution, and predicts the recruitment success at different places around the North Atlantic. And then finally, another one that's being done at CFAS on juvenile sea bass. So sea bass have an interesting life cycle that they have very specific habitat requirements for the nursery stages, so on the coast. And so we're trying to predict larvae settlement and the nursery stages. And it's an individual-based model coupled to a physical model which tracks particles. And during good years and bad years, you can see that the difference in the numbers of particles that are retained is heavily influenced by temperature. So I've just sort of said all these really just to show some of the models that are being applied across Europe on these more sort of mechanistic models. Most of them require a lot of parameterization, whereas the correlative models, you can throw these simpler models at a lot of species. So it's always a balance. Do you go into a lot of detail for one species or do something that's a bit quicker and easier for lots of species? And any questions?
Thanks. You guys seem to be doing a lot of work across Europe.
Yeah, thanks, John. I was interested in this, that none of the models could really cope with the mackerel.
Yeah.
So how bad or good were they? What couldn't they predict, cope with the rapid expansion to the west, or what was the main thing they missed out on?
I mean, the correlative models, they just don't. Well, Rod, you can answer if you did the model.
Yeah, well, I think part of it is that we don't have the distribution data for the mackerel. So some of the modelling, it either used, so Miranda's, where she had lots of species on the table, I think she used Ovis and Juvid, which are sort of national databases. So they just didn't have pelagic survey data in them. And then we've also looked at similar models which use the bottom trawl survey. So again, you're just not capturing mackerel as much or as well in that survey data. I'm not sure about any of the others that haven't shown so well, but I think that we're just not picking up the environmental variables that match with the present, which is fairly fundamental, really.
Because we're only using temperature, salinity, and depths, mainly.
Okay.
And then there's the larval dispersal stage, obviously, which is with